Alright, so this is just going to be a quick review of the study guide for Exam 1. I'm just going to go through and briefly hit some of the highlights, but if you have any questions about this, please feel free to let me know. So remember that Exam 1 is going to be multiple choice, true, false, and matching. There'll be 50 questions total, and you will have 75 minutes to take the test. So once you open it, you'll need to complete it within 75 minutes. One thing to say also is that there are 2 opinion questions on the exams. So for the last 2 multiple choice questions, you will get credit for those questions regardless of which answer you choose. They'll look a little bit different from other questions, something like which one of these is most important to you, that kind of thing. I will make sure that students get the points for that. However, Canvas doesn't let me set questions up as opinion questions. I have to set them up like regular questions with a correct answer. So if you click on the answer that is marked the correct answer, then you'll get those points automatically. But if your opinion is something that's not set as the correct answer, then you won't get those points in the moment, but after the exam closes, I can go back and set the exam to give full credit to all students for those questions. I say all that to say that your grade may go up a little bit after the exam closes. So let me know if you have any questions about that. So Exam 1 is going to be covering all the information we talked about in this first section of the class. So the first set of slides talked about theories and research. We said that development, this process of growing and changing that begins at conception and goes throughout the lifespan, has lots of different periods, and you have this information in your notes. So we have, prenatal development, we have infancy, we have early childhood, middle childhood, so on and so forth, and that throughout these stages we're going to be developing in 3 main areas. So we have a physical, biological development. We have cognitive development, the way that we think. But we also have socio-emotional development, so we grow in the way that we relate to other people. Now, we talked about how development could be viewed lots of different ways, that we could view development as continuous, which would say that we develop very gradually and subtly, so that when you move from one stage to the next stage, there's not an obvious change. You're constantly developing a little bit over time. Discontinuous would say that there are obvious changes in development, that there are stages where you stay about the same while you're in a stage, and then when you're ready to go to that next stage, you have a large jump in your development, and it's very obvious when you go from one stage to the next. So certain theorists would suggest that development is more continuous, some more discontinuous. We also talked about universal versus context-specific development. Does everyone develop in the same way? Does everyone go through those same steps of development? Or is it that your environment and the culture that you're raised in causes different people to develop in different ways? And then, of course, the nature versus nurture debate refers to, are we impacted more by biology, by our genetics, which would be nature, versus nurture, which would be our environment, which could include parenting that we received, peers, culture, media, teachers, neighborhood, etc. Now, that was a little bit in general about development, and then we talked about some specific theorists. So know a little bit about each one of these that we discussed. First of all, Freud, who had a psychoanalytic, you might hear psychodynamic perspective. So he would say that we have, the majority of our personality is unconscious, and that we have 3 parts of our personality. So we have the id, the ego, and the superego. And that's the order that they develop in. So the id is something that's present at birth, and it's only focused on meeting its own needs. And then the ego develops next. The ego wants to satisfy the needs of the id, but it's going to be more concerned about finding rational, logical ways instead of the id just demanding what it wants and not caring who it hurts in the process. The ego will try to satisfy the id while finding a rational way to do that. And then the superego is the last part of the personality to develop, according to Freud, and that the superego is your morality, basically, that you internalize from parents, from religious beliefs, from your culture, and the superego is always thinking about other people. So the id thinks about you, the superego thinks about other people, and the ego is the rational part of your personality trying to balance those out. So then Freud had a theory, and Freud's theories are certainly interesting, difficult to research because of the unconscious emphasis there, but a lot of his theories focused on sexuality and aggression. So Freud's view of development is that people go through these psychosexual stages, and that while you're in a particular stage, if your development goes well, then you're able to move on successfully to that next stage, but that if your development is hindered in some way, then you can have a fixation at a particular stage and really not go on to develop appropriately. So he talked about having an oral stage, anal, phallic, and then latent, and then genital. I had to think about that for a second. So during each stage, there is a particular emphasis. During the oral stage, the baby is meeting his or her needs by chewing on things, putting things in their mouth. During the anal stage, that's when potty training is happening. During the phallic stage, that's where, according to Freud, kids become aware of their genitals and aware of their sexual urges. Once again, this is according to Freud. And then you go through a latent period where other things seem to be more important, and sexuality kind of takes a back seat for a while. And then in that genital phase, which is going to last from puberty for the rest of your life, that's where Freud would say those sexual urges really become very important. Certainly an interesting theory. Erikson also could be considered a psychodynamic. He had some similar beliefs, but Erikson had stages that he described as psychosocial as opposed to psychosexual. The idea that as you go through stages, you have a conflict to resolve, you have a need to develop there, and then if you get through that stage successfully, then you bring resilience into the next stage. But if you don't, then you can be hindered with that, kind of similar to what Freud would say about his stages. But Erikson had stages like, for example, trust versus mistrust, or autonomy versus shame and doubt. So in each of these stages, you're struggling with something, and you learn from the environment, the people that you're around, whether or not, for example, in the first stage, can I trust other people? And if you learn to trust others because you're given appropriate, consistent care, then you'll carry that strength on to the next stage. But if not, then Erikson would say that trust issues may be something that continues to be a problem for you. We also talked about behaviorism, the idea that behavior is most important, that you are what you do, and that we learn from modeling other people, we learn from conditioning. I know that during the cognitive lecture we talked about reinforcement and punishment, operant conditioning, and we talked about classical conditioning as well. Those would be ideas that would fall under the category of behaviorism. Social learning theory, so we're learning from the role models, the people that we spend time around, the people that we see as successful, and then good things are happening to them. Kind of similar to behaviorism, we're going to be modeling their behaviors and learning from them. So then there would be some cultural differences in development because we're learning from the people around us, more nurture rather than nature. Piaget emphasized a discontinuous view of development. There are very specific discrete stages, so you have sensory motor, pre-operational, you have your concrete operational, and then your formal operational, so you can take a look at that. We kind of generally discussed how as we go through those stages, people are able to think more logically. During the pre-operational stage, you still have a lot of errors in logic, which we talked about also in the cognitive lecture, things like difficulty with conservations, with centration, or an egocentric viewpoint. But as you move forward into concrete operational, you can think logically about concrete, tangible situations, something that you can see right in front of you. And then once you get into a formal operational stage, you can think logically about more things in general, even things you can't see. And then we talked about Bronfenbrenner and his view that it's your social environment is kind of like an onion, like there's layer upon layer upon layer, and they're all interacting with each other. So you're in the middle of these circles, and then you have layers to your environment. So you have a microsystem, the people that are closest to you that you interact with. You have the mesosystem, the interaction between all of your microsystems interacting with each other. So microsystem might be you and your parents, for example, or you and your teacher, but a mesosystem would be the interaction between your parents and your teachers, right? And then you keep peeling back the layers, and so then you have components of the environment that you don't have much control over, but they still impact you, and you can go all the way out to the time period that you live in, the culture that you live in, still important, even though you don't have a lot of control over those. And then when we're talking about research, we said that a theory is a big picture idea that helps us explain the information that we've gathered. Just because something is a theory doesn't mean it's true, but it's something we're going to test. And a theory is too complicated to test in any one study, so we develop a hypothesis. A hypothesis is a specific testable prediction that is consistent with our theory that we can actually go out and test in our research. And we want to make sure that our research is high quality, so we're going to make sure to use measures and do research that is reliable and valid. So reliability refers to consistency, and validity refers to accuracy, measuring what you're supposed to be measuring. We also talked about gathering people to be in your study. So a population would be all the people that you're interested in. A sample would be a subset of the population that actually takes part in your research. Now, we talked about a couple of major types of research, correlational research and experimental research. So correlational research has the goal of prediction. So you're just measuring two naturally occurring things and looking for a relationship between them. It does not allow for causation, though. Experimental research allows you to determine causation, to answer those why questions, but correlational research does not allow for that. We talked about strength and direction related to correlational research. So direction is a positive correlation or a negative correlation. So with a positive correlation, they're moving in the same direction. They're both going up or both going down at the same time. So class attendance goes up, grades go up. Class attendance goes down, grades go down, for example. With a negative correlation, we're saying that as one goes up, the other goes down, one goes down, the other goes up. So they're moving in opposite directions. Exercise goes up, weight goes down, exercise goes down, weight goes up. So in addition to knowing the direction, we also want to know the strength. The strength tells us how closely they're related to each other. And we give a number between 0 and 1.00 for this strength. And the larger the number, the stronger the correlation. So a 0.7 correlation is stronger than a 0.5 correlation, for example. And one thing to note is that the direction does not dictate anything about the strength. So a negative 0.4 correlation and a positive 0.4 correlation have the same strength. You only look at the number to determine the strength. And once again, this is just a quick review, but if you have questions, feel free to email me. So experimental research allows us to determine causation because we're actually manipulating something. So an independent variable is something that we manipulate. A dependent variable is something that we measure. So for example, I could have a treatment study where one group gets my new treatment and the other group gets a placebo or a fake treatment, and then I measure their symptoms. The independent variable would be the type of treatment you receive because that's what I manipulated between the two groups. The dependent variable, what you're measuring here, would be the symptom severity. And then we talked about time periods. Longitudinal research involves following the same participants as they age. And so maybe we gather information when they're 5, when they're 10, when they're 15, for example. Cross-sectional research would mean that I might gather information from a group of 5-year-olds and then from another group of 10-year-olds and another group of 15-year-olds all on the same day, and you have different people in different groups. And then we talked a little bit about ethics here, about making sure that we're not harming our clients. We talked about the different, or our research participants in this particular situation, but clients as well. We talked about informed consent versus assent. So the one who has the legal right to give consent is the one who gives informed consent. So that would be the participant if they're over the age of 18. And if they're younger than 18, it would be a parent. But then assent would be when a person is not able to give consent for themselves, usually because of age, because they're less than 18. But then you're saying, even though you're not legally required, I would still like for you to agree to be part of the research so they feel like they have some control over what's happening to them. All right, prenatal development, we talked about, the egg is the sex cell from mom, sperm is the sex cell from dad, about how they come together to form a zygote, and that we're talking about sex chromosomes. A father is the one who's going to be dictating the sex of the baby because men have X and Y chromosomes. Women only have X chromosomes. So mom will always give an X. If dad also gives an X, then we have a girl. If dad gives a Y, then we have a boy. We talked about genotype versus phenotype. Genotype is strictly nature. We're talking about your biology alone here, what your genetics say. Phenotype is the expression of those genetics. It's a combination of both nature and nurture. So not just the genetics you receive, but the way that interacts with your environment to actually show which traits a person has. We talked about identical versus fraternal twins. So identical twins are essentially genetically identical, very similar at least. And that happens when you have one egg, one sperm that's split into two. But then you can also have fraternal twins where we have two eggs, two sperm, but they're in the womb at the same time. And so they're born at the same time, but then no more genetically alike than any other sibling pair. And then we talked about prenatal development, about how we had that time period where we would call the developing individual a zygote, and then we have the embryo, and then we have the fetus, and we talked about the different things that are happening throughout that, so you can take a look at those. For example, talking about how there's a time period where we usually feel baby kick for the first time, that kind of thing. So you can look back over those. We also talked about things that were dangerous during pregnancy. One thing in particular to note here, we talked about alcohol, about fetal alcohol syndrome, a combination of medical and psychological issues that are associated with alcohol use during pregnancy. And so the safest course of action is to abstain completely from using alcohol during pregnancy and breastfeeding, because we don't know what amount of alcohol is safe and what amount is dangerous. So the safest, best practice, and don't miss this question if it's on the test, the best practice is to abstain from alcohol during pregnancy and breastfeeding. But then also there are other things like illnesses that could potentially be passed on during pregnancy, that kind of thing. We talked about different options for prenatal testing, so you can take a look at that. We might want to take a sample of the placenta. We might want to take a sample of the amniotic fluid to test for the possibility of genetic issues. So stages of labor, we have everything leading up to pushing, so going from the cervix being completely closed to being completely dilated. That's the first stage. During that second stage, we have the baby actually being born, delivered, and then in the third stage, we're going to have the placenta, the afterbirth, that has to be delivered as well. Of course, there are complications that can be associated here during birth. Oftentimes, this has to do with a lack of oxygen supply. Mothers may need emergency C-sections, that kind of thing. We talked about how sometimes people struggle to adjust to parenthood, about how this is an especially difficult time for women when you've had a lot of hormonal changes, there's a lot of emotions that come along with having a baby, especially a first baby, and then difficulty with self-care when you're caring for an infant, proper diet, sleep, that kind of thing, and so postpartum depression can develop during this time period, so keeping an eye on that. We talked about good and bad things about having children. You can take a look at that. We had an activity, which I really enjoyed reading your thoughts on that. When it comes to advantages to having kids, of course, they're adorable and they're precious. And it talks about having someone to care for you in old age and passing on the family name and all of that good stuff, and potentially helping people mature. But then also disadvantages, there's a lot of responsibility, and sometimes people feel that role overload where they kind of lose who they are in parenting, lack of privacy, that kind of thing. We also talked about how family size has gone down somewhat over the years, but that we still see women of a lower socioeconomic status having more children typically. All right. And then we had a set of slides on physical development in infancy and early childhood. So we talked about reflexes, and some of these reflexes are important for survival, things like rooting and sucking. Some of them are kind of precursors to motor development, so stepping, that kind of thing. An APGAR score is going to give you a general idea of how healthy a baby is based on things like their reflex and their appearance, so color, their breathing, that kind of thing. So you're going to get an APGAR score early on, and then potentially another one a few minutes later to measure health of baby. We talked about things that newborns do, and so you can take a look at that. So sometimes they're awake and kind of quiet and alert. Sometimes they're awake but crying, maybe sleeping. So we do have different kinds of cries. We have, the kind of soft cries that kind of build up, and maybe baby's hungry, or maybe we need a diaper change. Then there's that pain cry that's very loud and kind of pausing to gasp, that kind of thing. We talked about sleeping arrangements, about how co-sleeping is the norm in 90% of the world, but that's based on culture, and in an individualistic culture like ours, co-sleeping is less common, although it might be on the rise because of an increase in breastfeeding. But SIDS is a concern, so sudden infant death syndrome is a very unfortunate situation. It happens most often between 2 to 4 months of age, and it's usually a breathing related issue. So certainly we cannot prevent all cases of SIDS, but there are some recommendations that babies, especially during that early time, should be put to sleep on their back. Pacifier use can help a baby from drifting off too deeply into sleep, so it could be helpful. Babies that are breastfed are also less likely to have issues here. By making sure that the baby's sleep environment is safe, so you don't want it to be too hot. You want to remove pillows, blankets, anything that could get around baby's face. But the reason why 2 to 4 months is an especially dangerous time is that the reflexes have started to decrease a little bit from birth, but baby is probably not yet rolling over successfully, so baby may get stuck in a position where it's difficult to breathe. So we talked about breastfeeding and nutrition. There certainly are advantages to breastfeeding. Breast milk has the right amount of everything, and there's research to suggest that things like jaw-related issues, obesity, even intellectual issues, when babies that are breastfed are a little bit more likely to be more intelligent, but that's correlational, that's not causational, it's not experimental research. Of course, there are some situations where women are not able to breastfeed or are not advised to breastfeed, medical issues, latching problems. So exclusively pumping milk is an option, as well as feeding formula. But making sure that children receive appropriate nutrition is huge. We talked about the development of the nervous system. So you have neurons, the nerve cells that make up your nervous system. So messages come in a dendrite that surrounds the cell body, goes down the axon to the terminal junctions at the end of the neuron, and then from there the message is passed through neurotransmitters that are released into the synapse, that little gap in between neurons, and then go on to the receptors, so the dendrite to the next neuron, and then in the dendrite down the axon to the terminal junction, neurotransmitters cross the synapse and then onto the dendrite of the next neuron, so on and so forth. We talked about gross motor skills as being large movements, things like walking, jumping, running, versus fine motor skills that involve more precision, about how babies use their fine motor skills for grasping, picking things up. But as you get older, things like drawing, writing, tying your shoes would also be fine motor skills. We talked about the senses, about how newborns have a great sense of smell, and so they can recognize familiar smells and be comforted by those. They have taste, especially a preference for sweet taste. Touch is there, sensitive to pain, that they can hear, but their hearing may not be quite as acute as adult hearing, and they can hear the tones that are similar to speech especially well. And then vision is usually the sense that is least developed at birth, but then does develop within that first year. We talked about the self-concept. Usually around 2-ish is when kids start to have an understanding that they are separate from their environment. But as you get older, that self-concept becomes more sophisticated. You might explain yourself more in terms of personality or your hopes and dreams rather than your hair color and the name of your dog, for example, which is what you're probably going to get when you ask a 3-year-old. All right, and then we talked about cognitive development. So we said that our schemas or our schemes or our mental categories for helping us organize information, that assimilation and accommodation are ways that we make sense of our environment. So with assimilation, we make sense of new information by putting it into the categories that we already have. With accommodation, we make sense of something new and interesting by changing the categories that we already have, because maybe the categories we have didn't fit this new information, so we have to change those. Piaget is one that's going to keep coming up when we talk about cognitive development. So we talked about the sensory motor and pre-operational stages. Sensory motor being birth to 2, pre-operational being 2 to 7. And so you can take a look at that. One thing we did say is that Piaget's theory is not without criticism. It's probably not accurate to suggest that all kids reach the same milestones at the same time without taking into account their environment, training that they receive, parenting, culture, but it is a good rule of thumb. And then we talked about learning being an important part of our development, about how we learn from classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and modeling, which involves imitating. And classical conditioning is just about learning associations. So when things go together in time, we learn that they go together in time. And then we can use that information to make a prediction. Like if there's a baby that's looking forward to eating, baby's going to learn that the bottle means food. They learn the association between the food and the bottle. And then they'll respond to the bottle. Even if it's an empty bottle, they'll want that bottle because they've learned the bottle means food. They've learned those associations. Operant conditioning involves consequences to our behavior that impacts whether or not that behavior happens again in the future. If you're reinforced for something, it's more likely to happen again. If you're punished, it's less likely to happen again. We talked about memory, about how we don't usually have memory for the very first part of our life, and maybe that's because we lack communication, we lack verbal skills, maybe it's because we lack a self-concept, but the parts of the brain like the hippocampus that handle memory are developing from a pretty early age. And if we're talking about young children, preschoolers, we could perhaps have accurate eyewitness testimony if we ask questions in the right way. We want to make sure to ask those questions very soon after an event. We want to make sure that kids know it's okay for them to be honest and to say, I don't know. And we want to make sure that we ask questions in kind of an open-ended way, not in a leading way that tells kids there's only one right way for them to answer. We talked about Vygotsky's theory, which is basically that we learn from people that are more advanced than us, from more skilled others, and that it's almost an apprenticeship kind of situation. When you don't know how to do something, you partner with someone who does know how, and they can teach you, and then you have someone who is working with you with the right level of support, and that's scaffolding. So with scaffolding, you're providing support that they need, not too much support because they might get used to that support and not be able to do it without it, but you have to provide the right level of support to keep them in their zone of proximal development, and that's what ZPD stands for here. Your zone of proximal development is that sweet spot where we want to keep you in an education process where we're not focusing on something that you already know how to do or something that you can't do even with help. We want to focus on something that you could do with a little bit of help from a more skilled adult, usually an adult, but another person. And then language development, so we talked about how babies start off cooing, and then they start babbling, and then from there they say their first words, and fast mapping usually happens at about 18 months where we have this huge burst in vocabulary, and kids are going to have more vocabulary if they've been read to, if they've had parents that talk to them frequently, that kind of thing. And we also talked about being bilingual, about how that can be really helpful for an increased vocabulary, but also it can be helpful for things like impulse control, that kind of thing. Alright, well this has just been a quick review of the information for Exam 1. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me. Make sure that you take the test during the time that it is open, and I will be posting another video for you guys after Exam 1, so I'll talk to you guys then.